Testing, testing, test, testing.
Can you hear?
Good morning, Cubs. Today is Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. My name is Jesus Martinez.
And my name is Alexander Ochoa.
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, Texas Pledge, and a moment of silence.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to the Texas, one state under God, one indivisible. Please remain standing for a moment of silence.
Thank you, Cubs. You may be seated. The line ways to be respectful, responsible, safe, and kind. Let's cover our coughs and sneezes, wash our hands, treat each other well, be nice to each other, not say mean things, and be there to each other. Attention, Cubs. Order your yearbook today. The deadline to order your yearbook is April 20th, 2025. So you have time to save your money. The cost is $35. And you can submit your order to Miss Soto in the principal's office. The yearbook flyers will be out this week with more information. Only 75 copies will be sold.
Attention Cubs, you are invited to Star Extravaganza. It will be March 27th from 5 to 6 p.m. You will earn a free dress pass by attending. Refreshments and snacks will be provided.
Attention Cubs, the CJHS Book Fair is here. It will be held at the library from March 24th to March 28th. Come in and check our books and merchandise. Every purchase will help our library buy more books you like. The book fair will be open during the Star Extravaganza, so invite your parents. Let's go to the other side of the studio for announcements from our guests.
Good morning, Cubs.
Good morning.
Cubs, yes, we do have the book fair next week, so we hope that you can join that. We also will be sending out the den time selection. So today, during your den time, if you get a sheet of paper, that is because you are able to select a den time. If you do not get a sheet of paper, that is because a teacher has selected you for interventions for 9-week 4. So we will get that done today, and new den times will start next week.
I don't really have anything else.
Sorry,
you guys.
Cubs, we love you. We hope that you have a great rest of your week. The decisions we make do have consequences, so let's make good decisions. We've had a really good Monday and Tuesday. Let's have a great Wednesday and finish the week strong, as this is the end of the 9-week 3 this week, and grades are due this weekend, so we want to make sure that you have everything taken care of. Track is in season today. Tennis does begin, so if you're interested in tennis for 7th and 8th grade, those are meeting today after school. You'll have tennis practice, and then after tennis there will be a parent meeting, so when your parents pick you up, just have them hang out so that you guys can meet with Coach Buga. Please make sure that you have your physical and rank 1 completed for both track and tennis, because you do need those in to be able to participate. That and your grades, so take care of that. We love you, Cubs. We hope you have a great Wednesday.
Thank you. Today's cafeteria menu includes
Bacon cheeseburger,
cheese quesadilla,
saffron or butter jelly sandwich,
chicken patty sandwich,
spicy pepperoni pizza,
cheeseburger,
spicy breaded chicken sandwich,
cheese pizza,
grilled cheese,
turkey and cheese sub.
all American salad.
We would like to wish a very special birthday to
Emiliano Montes.
Angel Yani Carpio.
Happy
birthday! Cubs, let's take a look at our weather for today.
First off, happy birthday to Emiliano and Angel. And as you can tell, yesterday was really windy outside, huh? It was red, orange, and throughout the day. So we will see that high wind warning, but it's gonna be three more. The harder it's gonna be.
In the morning, it'll go higher to 69 degrees, sunny sky, and 0% chance of rain.
This afternoon is gonna bring the red dust back with 76, and it's gonna be windy with 0% chance of rain.
In the evening, it'll go lower to 57 degrees and windy and 0% chance of rain.
And overnight it's gonna be a 47 with clear night with 0% chance of rain. And remember, close your eyes. Do not get dust in your eyes, your mouth. Be careful outside. Back to you.
Sorry, Cubs, one more announcement. We would like just to remind our fine arts teachers that we are doing the building bonds today. So fine arts, please try to get your building bonds in throughout the day during your class periods. Have a great day.
Thank you. This concludes today's announcements. Cubs, remember that we love you.
And that I could, Junior.
We are working together for a better tomorrow. Bye.